Call to order the special meeting of the Solvang City Council, May 20th. Can we get a roll call?
Councilmember Clark,
Here.
Dearness,
Here.
Johnson,
Here.
Waite, here, Mayor Toussaint.
Here. Robert, you mind leading us in the flag?
Yes, please stand up. Place your right hand over your heart. Repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, so because this is a special meeting, there is no regular public comment or council comments, so we'll move right into item number 1. Lisa, can we get a title readout?
Item 1, CalPERS OPEB request for proposal review.
And can we get a staff report given by Xenia?
Good evening, Council. So this item in front of you is the discussion on options to address CalPERS unfunded liabilities. The presentation today includes first looking at previous council direction and how we got here today. Second, we'll turn towards looking at the City of Solvang CalPERS unfunded liabilities themselves and what does it mean for Solvang. Then we'll talk about some of the developed strategies to address CalPERS unfunded liabilities that have been developed by organizations throughout the state of California and participants in CalPERS. And then finally, we'll look at the recommendations and some of the alternatives to the recommendation. So the history of previous council direction is that in October of 2018, the council heard a staff report outlining the CalPERS unfunded liabilities and structure for the city of Solvang. Following that, council directed staff to do an RFP to develop strategies to address CalPERS and also OPEB unfunded liabilities. Today's presentation really focuses on the CalPERS portion of unfunded liabilities. So what does it mean for Solvang? Essentially, CalPERS became a subject of discussion across the state during the last change by the board of CalPERS that changed the interest rate or expected rate of return from 7.5% to 7% that was used for actuarial analysis, which meant that organizations throughout the state that are participant of CalPERS, which there is about 3,000 of them participating with CalPERS, would have significant impacts to their both unfunded liabilities and payments required for unfunded liabilities, as well as towards normal costs. So CalPERS usually utilizes strategies to where they smooth out the impacts of the payments to the organizations. So this particular impact was phased in over 3 years and then also stair-stepped in 5-year periods on each one of those phases. And so for all organizations part of CalPERS, the full impact takes place in 2024, 2025 for this particular change in the policy for CalPERS. The City of Solvang unfunded liability in total, as of the last available valuation, June 31, 2017, was $3.8 million. So this resulted primarily from these 4 conditions in the past. The greatest impact that fed into unfunded liability was the Great Recession and the losses in the investments, the actual assets. So once you lose those assets, and it was significant at that time, you can't really earn your way back into being fully funded. The other change that impacted unfunded liabilities for all agencies was changes in demographic assumptions to where CalPERS realized that people have just longer life expectancy. So that was another impact to unfunded liabilities. CalPERS used to have a rolling amortization period, so they always had 30 years going forward. Starting in 2015, they implemented a fixed 30-year amortization period where all unfunded liabilities would have to be paid off within that fixed time frame. And then finally, what I just talked about, the change in policy in the expected rate of returns going from 7.5% to 7% because they are employing more safeguards in terms of safeguarding the assets was the result of the significant change that is going to impact agencies' budgets through 2024. So in terms of annual payments towards unfunded liabilities to pay this off within 30-year time frame, what you're looking at based on this last change in interest rate is that in 2018-19, the required payment for the city of Solvang towards unfunded liabilities was a total of $213,000, which equates to about 9.7% of total payroll for the city. And that will continue to rise to about $416,000 or, okay. So $416,000 by 24-25, or about 19% of total payroll. That's pretty standard for organizations across CalPERS for it to double in that time frame. So let's look at some of the strategies. As I mentioned, this was a big change for organizations across the state. So there's lots of people that have put their heads into this, including the League of California Cities. And so these are some of the strategies that have been developed to address CalPERS. One of the options that agencies have is to prepay more towards CalPERS. So not just pay what's required by CalPERS, but actually make one-time payments. Usually that can be done. Agencies develop different strategies, but if there's a fund balance left at the end of the year, there's a surplus, you could apply that towards CalPERS, or you could look at your overall long-term financial strategy and see how much, if the city pays today, the city could save in a long time by making those prepayments. So this strategy reduces the long-term costs of what you would pay to CalPERS, but once you give money to CalPERS, it's there. So the city loses control over what CalPERS might require in the future. So say CalPERS would make further changes within its policy to once again change the expected rate of return. The city then would be once again required to pay whatever CalPERS is requiring to pay and wouldn't have that cash on hand. So an alternative to paying towards CalPERS directly that's been developed is forming a pension 115 trust. So IRS allows organizations to form this trust. There's really only two agencies or two consultants or managers that have been issued a letter from IRS to manage the trusts like this. And once you form this trust, the money that's allocated into the trust can only be used for pensions. But once the money is in the trust, the city can actually invest in equity the same as CalPERS does. So normally the city investment policies based on the state of California, you cannot invest in equity, so this gives you the same kind of investment powers as CalPERS has. The good of this option is that the money is still under the city control, so you have it in the trust. It can only be used for pensions, but when CalPERS changes their requirements and their payments, you can reach into this trust and thus smooth out the impacts on operations of the city. Another option is agencies that have looked at their forecasts and recognize that they don't have a balanced structure sometimes choose to modify its operations and modify its levels of deliveries on service. So this is basically just a realignment of budget operations that really should be based only on decisions of the overall fiscal health. As part of sort of the previous option to change the structure of the costs, change the structure of the budget, is also part of transparent bargaining and basically asking employees to be part of the solution to pay more towards CalPERS. Jurisdictions also have, in California, you have to have this approved by voters. So revenue options for agencies are limited to voter approval on what's available, but there are options out there, for example, of passing an add-on local sales tax to help pay for this issue. The last option is pension obligation bond. Pension obligation bond is really not recommended by all experts in the field. GFOA and CSMFO organizations do not recommend this. Obligation bond would really be issued to pay off the unfunded liability, so you're still subject to further changes in CalPERS policies and could have further unfunded liabilities, and you're really restructuring one type of debt into a different type of debt that's set. So that is risky and not recommended. The council has previously asked to discuss what it would take to exit CalPERS. So by virtue of the contract with CalPERS, they have the ability to basically use a rate of return that's very protectionist to them. So essentially they're saying that if, in the worst case scenario, if we want to make sure that there's enough funds for us to pay for this future obligations. So they use a very conservative rate of return of 1.75% to 3% is the range that they can charge the organization. It's called the hypothetical termination liability to exit CalPERS. So you're really looking, right now the city of Solvang has $3.8 million in unfunded liability. To exit CalPERS, that's your range on this slide. So it could be anywhere between $27 million to $30 million for you to have to pay right away to terminate that contract. So what staff recommends is that as we develop long-term forecasts for the city as part of the 2019-20 budget development, that we look at the overall picture of the funds, all of your major operating funds that carry this unfunded liability, a general fund, water fund, enterprise fund, and wastewater fund, and for us to come back to you as part of that budget development with further recommendations and strategies as to how to address the unfunded liabilities for CalPERS in order to secure long-term fiscal health for the city. Your other alternatives would be to return with recommendations on a different date, return with a comprehensive long-term financial liabilities analysis after council strategic retreat. You could also direct staff to move forward with one of the 6 proposals, and those proposals are attached to the agenda item in your packet, or you could reissue a modified request for proposals.
All right, thank you very much for that staff report. Quick question. You, on one of your slides there, it talked about change service level delivery options. Can you explain more about that?
Right, so this would basically be just a budgeting exercise. Organizations.
One slide.
Sorry.
There you go. Yeah.
So as you evaluate your long-term forecasts and the health of your funds, there will be some of the fixed costs that are just to operate the city as it is, and then there will be some discretionary or kind of initiative type of costs within that budget. So you as council have the ability to modify those allocations. So this option is found, other organizations use this in order to bring organizations into a balanced budget, which would mean that your ongoing revenues meet your ongoing operating expenditures in the long run. So those organizations that, because of this doubling impact of unfunded liabilities towards CalPERS, some organizations have found themselves in a space where they don't have a balanced budget, so their revenues don't meet their ongoing expenditures, and therefore they would take action to bring those two in line and basically take reductions or find alternatives, methods of delivering service.
So by this, you're really talking about like different options such as putting money into a trust or
I think you're talking about like reducing services that the city offers.
Correct.
Stuff like that, right?
Well, yes.
So I think it's like, we're not supposed to discuss it, but that's my understanding is some of the services that the city's offering
Is your microphone on?
would be reduced. It is. I'm trying not to get too close. They told me I could get too close. So.
It sounds like a euphemism for cutting services and raising taxes.
Okay. I just
It's
trying
an
to
option.
clarify what that meant there. Are there any questions of the staff report from the council?
Yeah, I think there are some other options on the table which haven't been covered.
But just try to limit just to questions of the current staff report.
To what they have here, okay.
I do. On the option where we take out the bond, which is not recommended.
Pension obligation bonds?
Yes. What type of interest rate are you looking at usually, or do cities look at on that?
So pension obligation bonds, you would basically look at the market and then the rating of the city. And so currently the city doesn't have outstanding debt, so it would be a process of going through the credit agencies and obtaining a rating essentially for the city. And then based on the market rates and the rating quality and grade of the city would determine the rate that you would get on your bond issuance.
Okay, I have a couple of questions
Mhm.
about the staff report. If you could back up, I think, yeah, right there. How did you come up with the 30.8 million? Where did that come from? Because when I looked at the 2017 CalPERS report for Solvang, it was not that high. Where did that
So-
come from?
It's actually coming from the CalPERS valuation. The latest one is the 2017 one, and towards the end of the report, it's actually available online from CalPERS to anybody. There is a section on hypothetical termination liability, and so that's what they would charge an organization to exit the plan entirely. So the unfunded liability, if you stay with the plan, is $3.8 million.
So which report is it? Because this is dated as of June 30th, 2017, came right off their website, and it says, and this is only for the miscellaneous plan. I don't know if you're looking at all plans together, but, oh, I see, it's like 30.8 million.
I believe this is only one
1.75.
plan right here.
So the city of Solvang has
I see it. Yeah, unfortunately, I was looking at the wrong column. So that's the actual cost to get out of the program, if we were to buy ourselves out today.
correct. That's what they would
And what
require.
happens to, so essentially, we're forfeiting all the assets that we put into it currently, which are about, what, 11.5 million right here? And we have to add another 30 million on top of that?
Yes, because they're using that very low expected rate of
1.75%.
return. So then for you to buy out at that expected rate of return, you have to pay a lot more.
Okay, so we essentially are forfeiting the 11.5 million that we have now, and we have to add another 30 million?
Yes,
Is that right?
yes.
This sounds like, a-
I don't know if I would necessarily categorize it as forfeiting 11 million.
you're getting rid of it, you're just giving it
Yeah,
away.
yeah, but that $11 million, that is the members, so that's the employees' retirement payments, right? So once an employee retires and they take contributions out of, or, they start to draw on that defined benefit, then that 11 million is effectively the trust fund that pays for those costs as they make draw on their pension. So the $30 million is CalPERS applying instead of a 7% discount rate. So we've already seen what happened, the huge impact it had on cities going from 7.5% to 7% on the discount rate. This would effectively be CalPERS taking the calculation and applying a 1.75% discount rate. So there would be, a full 5.25% reduction in the assumed investment return. And I believe it's because CalPERS then is going to take, that trust fund for Solvang, and they're effectively going to invest it in, really low risk mechanisms like, I don't know, bonds.
Treasury bonds.
Treasury bonds, exactly.
We're looking at like 5-year treasury bonds, not even 10-year, which are paying 2.5 today, close to 2.5. So
Yeah,
I guess what I'm astonished at is that it takes $30 million to provide the kind of, almost 31 million to provide the retirement that they're promising.
Yeah, because what that amount of funding would do then is in perpetuity, based on their calculations, handle all pension obligation for every employee that is currently employed today.
All right, so I just wanted to make note of that because we'll come back to that in the near future. And also, you're using the number of $3.8 million for our current unfunded liability, right? And that's at 7% discount rate? Or is that 7.25?
That is 7.25, so the
Yeah, that
next
was from-
valuation will
From
increase the,
2016, 17, is that right, 17?
well, this is the second wave of the phased-in approach, so we went from 7.5 to,
Right. But if we were to use the 6% rate, it's higher, isn't it?
it is.
It's almost $3 million higher. 2.75, basically. So why aren't we using 6%?
We are not, so the board of CalPERS determines the expected rate of return that's applied, and so far the only action they took was to take the expected rate of return from 7.5 to 7.
Right, because they
So-
don't want to disturb, I'm making a point here, I'm sorry, I want to finish. So this came from the California Public Employees Retirement System, and they were acknowledging that the last 5-year return is only 5.1%. It's not even 6% for the last 5 years. They've underperformed the market every year for the last 5 years. And I'm making this point because we'll come back to this. If I had to hire them as an investment advisor, I would think long and hard. They are not the most successful investment advisors out there.
Are there any questions? Okay, with that, we'll go to public comment. Does anyone wish to speak on this item? Okay, seeing that, none, we'll go back to, take us back to council for discussion and action. Who would like to
Wait,
start?
I'm sorry, I have to ask one last question because it wasn't brought
Well,
up.
you can ask your question now, if
Can
you'd
I?
like to start.
Okay. What happens if we have another big correction? Did we address this in your presentation?
Yes,
When?
we will.
In other words, what happens to our UAL? Let's say we topped off at 100% fully funded. We follow everything you suggest here. We put in another however many millions that we have to get fully funded. And then we have another big correction.
Then there would be further unfunded liability, which is why, forming a trust is one of the options for the council to consider.
And this could happen again and again and again.
It's an ongoing discussion between the
So in
board.
other words,
and-
CalPERS doesn't have a floor like a typical annuity where you can't lose, and in fact, most annuities now have a guaranteed 2% floor. You can never lose, you always get at least 2%, and you can never lose your principal. And yet CalPERS doesn't have that. But it acts like an annuity, almost like a variable annuity in a way. This is a terrible program, isn't it? In other words, we take all the risk. The city bears all the risk. The employees put their minimum amount in, but the city is on the hook forever.
Unfortunately, that's just how the CalPERS system works. And if you're curious about what liability might happen, you could look back in the CAFA reports for the city of Solvang. You would notice that before recession, we were 100% funded. After recession, we were, I believe, nearly 50% funded. Today, we're probably around, 73% funded?
Yeah.
And that number is a figurative number based on the current discount rate today. So that's why even that 3.8 million that you see there now, that is based on the discount rate today. Whether or not, either way, they're rolling that discount rate down. And as they lower that discount rate down, that is the organization just formally recognizing that new data point. Trying to look at it a crystal ball, if a recession happened again tomorrow and we're 73% funded today, then and if it was the same thing that happened in 2008, then I would suspect that our new funding level would be like, maybe around 35% or lower, because the discount rate would also lower down too. So those are some of the scenarios that could happen. But at the end of the day, that investment account that is going to pay out in the liabilities for the employee benefits is still put on the backs of the taxpayers. So
City
the
taxpayers.
city is going to have to make up
The
Those-
difference
those
each and
differences,
every
yeah.
time it collapses. And what about OPEB? That wasn't mentioned in any of this. And yet it has its own unfunded liability. What is it now, 1.5 or 2 million?
I believe the last one's a little over 2 million.
I do not have the exact number.
Well, that's
this
okay,
point.
but we need to know that because I don't believe 3.8 is the right number. I think it is higher.
Right, so this item was structured around the conversation of CalPERS only. Yes, there's other unfunded liabilities, and as we discuss this in the context of long-term forecasts. There will be a discussion of other unfunded liabilities, such as OPEB, and also going forward,
The safety plan.
there will be the discussion of the needs on capital investment program as you go through your strategic retreat along
Yeah,
with
but it
those.
seems like we need to have a workshop just focusing on the problems with CalPERS, the 3 different programs that we have with them, and then the 4th one being OPEB. We need a comprehensive approach to this.
Yeah.
It's unfunded liability.
Again, the scope of this RFP was just really around this one retirement plan, so that's why it's not gonna, you're not gonna have the whole
Good point.
picture right
That's a
here.
good point.
So, Karen, would you like to, do you have anything to speak on this?
Yes.
Okay.
I just want to make a comment to my council members and the general public that the individuals that are in charge of the investments for CalPERS are very well qualified in investing in vehicles that are suitable for public entities. And I would never want to suggest that I would make better decisions than they do. When you speak about, Mr. DeJerna, speak about annuities and variable annuities, never say never, never say guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed. Yes, you can lose your principal. Yes, you can lose your rate of return. I think that when we're looking at this, we would want to pick a vehicle in which we could limit our loss liability. That's what I would be looking for, and have some sort of reserve to cover. So I would very much lean towards the formation of the trust to smooth over any changes in our liabilities in that respect. I mean, I don't see us at this point paying off our full liability, but I'm not an expert in this area. But I do think we should be able to maintain control of the majority of our finances, and I think setting up the trust would be a very good option.
Robert,
I agree with Karen. Some of the items I wish that we could
is your mic on?
do a combination, because as far as transferring the burden to visitors is an option, because we have 1.5 million visitors and 4,000 students. If you did increase the sales tax, I'm just saying as a worst case scenario, you're not overburdening the residents, but you're helping the people that are causing Solvang to be so popular to shoulder some of that. But it's almost like a combination of 3, 4, and 5. A bond, forget about it, and the 7th one or the 6th one, forget about it. But I think there's parts of each one of these options that could be blended into some form of attack here. That's just my opinion.
Daniel?
I kind of brought this up before back in March, but another option, I mean, to get out of CalPERS is to basically limit the hiring of new employees that are going to go into CalPERS. And so that would be having to do with the attrition that we talked about a while ago. I'm just thinking 10, 20 years down the road, as we go away from increasing staff, or as we go away from, basically, as we go away from having staff, that would be another way to get out of this pension liability. You would be outsourcing, so you would take a lot of that burden of these large liabilities that I don't think are going away. I think they're going to get worse, and they're not going anywhere. So that was just another option that we had discussed back in March that hasn't been put on the agenda yet, that would reduce the liability of this CalPERS liability that's drastically increasing all the time.
And I completely agree with that. That's a kind of a combination idea that Mr. Clark has put out there on the table.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch back on what she was saying about CalPERS. It has underperformed its benchmarks in every category, year after year. It is one of the worst performing pension funds out there.
You also have to recognize the size of the asset pools that they're managing, and when you start talking about that size asset pool, the performance is going to be somewhat limited by risks that they're able to take and overall gains that they can get on that large of a pool of
Far be
money.
it from me to tell them how to invest, but
Yeah.
if they would have just invested in the indexes alone,
Yeah.
or some combination of the indexes alone, they
But-
would have done far better than they're doing now.
Yeah.
And the second point is, I didn't say that I was, let me rephrase that. I'm not a financial advisor. But if a company, an insurance company, guarantees a product, then it is guaranteed by the full faith and credit of that particular company. Is that true?
Which is only true until they can no longer perform, and then you lose all of your capital.
Correct. And some of these insurance companies have been around since the 1850s. Is that correct?
Right, but CalPERS does not guarantee the money that you're.
That's
That's
my
going into
point.
their
That's
system.
exactly my
Okay.
point. But
The
some of
only
these
the only
insurance
guarantee
companies-
is the guarantee to the
Right.
employees.
But the insurance companies have done that since the 1850s very successfully. So all I'm suggesting is there are alternative products out there that do work, that companies have shown that they know how to invest in good markets and bad markets for more than 150 years.
But then you're talking about getting out of CalPERS.
That's correct.
Yeah, I think CalPERS has done a great job of making it so expensive to get out of it. It's almost like you can't get out of it unless you use some combination of not hiring into it, paying into it, and then slowly trying to pay it off with time, and then getting out of it that way through attrition. I don't know how you could pay off that. They lower that discount rate so drastically that.
Well, it's going to get worse. They have to go to 6%, according to the Actuarial Association of the United States. That's the goal, right? Is to move it to 6%? That's what the literature says.
I am not aware of that goal. I'm aware that there's
Okay.
further
So,
conversations going on.
I'm sorry,
with
this
the
is an
board.
ex parte thing, I think. If you go and Google this information, the actuarial, I'm not sure what the title is, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's an association of actuarialists, and they all suggested and recommended that the pension funds drop it to 6%, right?
Yeah, there's an actuarial standards board that makes various recommendations. Most of the actuarial standards of practice really come from the private side. And on the private side, they are generally recommending more conservative assumptions. I think some of that stems from, one of the major differences between the private side and the public side, not saying this is good or bad, but one of the major differences is one of those companies, that insurance company that's guaranteeing that annuity, can go out of business. And if it goes out of
Absolutely.
business, then there is loss there. And so while there is a floor on that, the dynamic of the public side is there is no necessarily going out of business, as has been seen by a couple of the high-profile bankruptcies in California, where the court stepped in through the bankruptcy proceedings and basically effectively said that the CalPERS liability is one of the primary positions, and so those cities then were able to renegotiate their positions. But ultimately, those pension liabilities are going to be required to be repaid by the taxpayers, because that was a contractual obligation that the city entered into.
Yeah, and Stockton and San Bernardino just went through that, right?
Yes, in Vallejo.
Yippee,
That's right.
So, yeah.
I like what Daniel, the path that Daniel was suggesting. I think we need to explore that. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, without doubt, it's not any one thing is going to take care of this. These are all
Exactly.
a mix of blends, and my concern with trying to pre-fund some of these things or pouring more into the system. I know some cities are switching over to like a 20-year amortization schedule. There's but my concern with that is just falling back on the pattern of what happened in the last recession and just waiting for the next recession to happen. So theoretically, you could pump the whole thing full today, and if we have another 2008 tomorrow, we'll be right back where we were the next day.
That is correct, and that's generally where a lot of agencies are starting to look at the pension trust, right, the Section 115 trust. I believe that's because under an economic emergency under IRS rules, you are allowed to access that. So if a city had a real-life dire emergency and declared a financial emergency, then there is access to some portion of that funds. I think it's less than 50%.
Like as a loan or something.
Yeah, I think so. So there is access to them, and they do outperform the local area investment fund LAIF by quite a bit, even on conservative from a conservative perspective. And so that is really meant to stabilize those rates. So as there's a recession and some loss, then you can pull from the 115 trust in order to pay for that increase in liability and stabilize your rates long term. So.
Okay.
What is your feeling about the gap that is that essentially, it's the projected benefits minus the return on the market value of our assets, that gap being the actuarial liabilities, right? And going back to 2008 to the present, the calculation that I picked, I mean, this is from the CAF reports that are online. It looks like that gap is at least 5%. And I mean, in other words, our expenses are growing 5% faster than the return on the investments. So even if we do fund it, we're still trying to close that gap as well.
Just so I understand, are you saying that the total liability of the CalPERS pension liability is growing at a faster rate than
The investment, or?
the investment?
That is correct.
Okay.
It's growing at 7%. And if you look at the return on our investment from 2008 to the present, from 9.3 million or something like that to 11.5, it's only 2% per year. If you were to look at it from the bottom, I guess in 2009, when it was 6 million, then it's a much higher rate. But that's not accurate, is it?
I don't think so, but there's a couple of primary reasons why from that 2008 to present number. So I think you're just doing a backwards calculation of here's what it was then, here's what it is now, what's that rate of return?
The
if I'm
compounded
understanding.
average growth rate.
Yeah. So a couple of things have happened with CalPERS. Is they've tried to stabilize the system because they CalPERS recognizes while I don't think they're very sympathetic to the municipalities' position that are into the pension program. One of the things that they're doing, or that they have been doing, is trying to blend out their investment strategies to try and prevent the wild swings. They got themselves, sort of in the perfect storm in the Great Recession, in that they were heavily invested in the stock market or equities, and heavily invested in real estate, and that's where they were seeing great returns because of the housing and just general real estate bubble that was formed. And so since then, they've tried to diversify the plan pool a little bit. Now there's been some Sacramento politics that have also led to reduction in their rate of return. So there's been a couple of pieces of legislation whereby certain industries, like the tobacco industry for one, was an area where CalPERS, per the legislature, wasn't allowed to invest in those types of investment mechanisms anymore, which further restricted CalPERS' ability to make as great a return as possible. So as they've blended out their overall portfolio to be a little bit more conservative so that they're not subject to wild swings in the market, and had their hands tied a little bit with their available investment mechanisms, that has reduced the rate. Now them going through systematically reducing the discount rate is a long-term strategy. So while we're looking at a point in time right now where we've got an unfunded liability, we're 10 years removed from a recession, who knows when the next one's on the horizon. That's a scary thing if you're looking at 72% funding. That is really somewhat a mathematical problem of today.
That's at 7.25%.
That's at 7.25%.
So at 6%, we're
Yes.
down to 60%
So
funding.
over the next 30 years or so, though, that liability will start to come down as they get more conservative with the discount rate. They get more conservative with the pension plans that are offered. So after 2013, we have PEPRA, the Pension Reform Act, which effectively limited the amount of pensions that is available to public employees hired, past that point in time. And one of the big things in PEPRA was that it required basically a 50-50 cost split of the normal contribution. So if for any reason, PEPRA employees, if there's major losses like there were during the Great Recession, and the normal cost spikes from 13% to 20%, well, the employees will pick up half of that cost, as opposed to the 1999 through 2012 pension plans, which were just ultimately rich because of the dot-com bubble that existed back in the turn of the millennium. That's where really rich plans came in, the 3 at 50 plan on public safety, the 2.7 at 55 on the miscellaneous, which were ultimately just unsustainable plans that were allowed for just a very short brief period of time in the overall CalPERS system. And these this perfect storm of losses under the Great Depression, as well as these two rich plans, was the perfect storm that we're now dealing with and trying to
And I
climb
get
out
that.
of.
But I'm going to have to push back again, only because I think at the end of the period last year, June 2018, they were touting the 11% return, right? And it was very exciting to see them do well, especially when the average has been 5%.
For that year, I think so,
Right.
yes.
And then by December 31st, 6 months later, they had a net loss. They went from 11% up to a net loss of 3.5%, meaning they lost 15%, basically. Did they really smooth out their investment portfolio? It doesn't sound like it.
I believe my index fund and my individual retirement account had those same losses through that quarter as well, as there was just a
I'm
drop
not
off
saying
in
it
the
didn't.
market.
I'm just saying the market dropped substantially.
That's
and we know
correct.
that, and
Yeah.
they didn't adjust accordingly.
I got a
think there's gonna be
question.
more of that.
Also, since we contract out with the sheriff's department or the police, they also have CalPERS, correct? Are they,
That is
they
correct.
participate in that?
No.
Okay, so,
They have their own county plan.
right. No, okay, so,
But I
ahead.
think I can answer your question. You're probably
Please.
wondering,
These are
because
copies.
we have two
Just wanna make
things. You have the fire department, which is funded by half of our property
particular
taxes,
website.
and that was done.
they
What was
are-
that, 10 years ago or something like that? I forget, it was a long time ago. So with that, you don't necessarily see that the money to even fund the fire department leaving the general fund. It's just because we're actually receiving half the sales tax, or I'm sorry, half the property tax. So that kind of wipes that off the general fund here. But you also then have the sheriff's contract, and that contract right there, you'll even notice like last year they kind of made a move to a was it full cost recovery type method. The numbers for what determines that cost aren't necessarily the most transparent. It's kind of like trying to look at library funding.
Correct.
But at the end of the day, they're going to be calculating the cost in for their retirement plans and for their own unfunded liabilities and spreading that cost up amongst the agencies that they serve.
Yeah, so
That's my opinion, and that's
okay.
why
That's what I'm asking is I wonder if with this issue we're having just with ours, but we're also going to have issues with contracts we have with these other public departments possibly.
and I would agree.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's why, because you already have from the county, they've already basically said every year, like I think originally they came with I think they wanted a 25% increase or something like that, and then they decided to do the same thing, like we're gonna ease it in over X year, so you can count on at least a
$1,000.
but that 5% increase is like a decent chunk because the sheriff's contract is one of the largest things next to payroll that leaves our general fund. So that will have an impact. And as you look at all these different items, you have the CalPERS funding that's going to be ramping up over the next X amount of years. But then you also have other things like library or sheriffs, and they're all relational. And I just kind of notice the same patterns either way you go. So I think staying on top of these issues and recognizing them is really important as you try to as we start going to the budgeting process, so that you can kind of see the whole picture of what the trend of where we're going. So that's why this is it's a sticky subject, and it's a hard one. There's no right answer. I think it's a mix and blend of all different things, and the original reason for how this even got here was we were looking at. We're already pretty well aware of the several options that have already been put here in the staff report of switching the amortization schedule, starting the 115 trust. There's tons of different. There's also like through annual pay negotiations. Negotiating how much the employees contributes. There's tons of different strategies to address all these types of things, and that's what's great about this kind of presentation is it touches on. All those different options there to slowly try to get control of this. But the reason why I asked for this RFP to come back up was that last year when we issued the RFP, the motion that I made was actually more geared around requesting RFPs that would solicit proposals for actually terminating the contract and leaving it, and what the options are there. It's not necessarily saying that it's a good idea, but in my opinion, the cost to leave the system is the true liability. So this is also just kind of like an accountability, transparency, and awareness issue of this CalPERS kind of topic. So what happened was the RFP that went out didn't necessarily reflect that of what the motion was. So I was asking to bring that back. I do agree with staff's recommendation, hiring anyone from these proposals that we have. I would not recommend doing that, but also that's not what this RFP was about. So what I was really looking for was to redirect the RFP for the original intent and soliciting new proposals. So with that, I do like alternative 2 in the staff report because it's talking about developing a plan for all the city's long-term financial liabilities, including water, roads, parks, facilities, and that kind of ties into analyzing all these different options and how we might want to fit things into our strategic budget as we go through the budgeting process. And then the other option would be the alternative 4, which is direct staff to reissue the modified request for proposals. So what I would like to make the motion for is to pursue alternative 2 of the staff report. And then for alternative number 4, I'd like to request that we modify the current RFP to reflect proposals for terminating the defined pension program, paying for the cost of such, and replacing it with a new defined contribution plan, and providing all information needed to do so to the interested parties, inclusive of current employee census information and current CalPERS account information. So with that, you're actually going to be looking at what options are there to actually leave the system and what that kind of financing and funding options would look like on a yearly basis in terms of the budget. But the only way to actually, everything that you guys talk about here about managing the liability, you're never going to escape it as long as you're in the CalPERS system.
Right.
And I think all of California will find that out in the next 5 years.
Did you make a motion?
That was my motion.
And I'd like to second that motion, but I'd like to amend it to include this similar analysis of OPEB, buying out of OPB. In other words, if you're going to do an analysis on buying out of the miscellaneous program, are you talking about all 3 or just the miscellaneous?
Well, I was just trying to just tackle one. I mean, you're probably going to see a lot of the same patterns across them, but it could be just a lot of extra work to try to do. I think we have 4 different.
We have 3, and then when you add OPEB, that's a 4th.
Yeah, so there's 4 total.
And actually, it does make sense to consider getting out of the safety plan. When I looked at it, buying out of it's really, relatively speaking, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the millions you're talking about for the other one. So that might be a way to go forward. And then OPEB is a much smaller plan as well, but unfortunately, healthcare costs are growing faster than returns on investment. So it's an ongoing problem. for the
Yeah,
state.
and what I was really looking for is the different options just around a program, because I would presume that they'd be pretty similar of all of them. But then if it was desirable and you also saw that one of the smaller programs could be bought out of, then that might be a direction the council wants to
Well,
pursue.
then that's my amendment, to include the smaller programs like the safety and OPEB. I think PEPRA's fine. From
Okay.
what I can tell, it's fine. It's stable.
So it's been seconded.
Just to be clear, you were okay with the amendment?
I'm sorry,
Okay.
I will accept the amendment.
Mayor Tucson,
Yes.
Councilmember Dearness,
Yes.
Clark,
Yes.
Johnson,
Yeah.
Wait.
No.
Okay, passes 4-1. Let's see, move on to item number 2.
Item 2, Planning Commission vacancy.
Could we get a staff report?
Mayor, council members, on April 22nd, 2019, the City Council was informed of the resignation of Commissioner Cuff as his family was relocating outside of California. The Solvang Municipal Code, Section 2-1-2 states that each city council member shall appoint one planning commissioner, subject to the ratification of the city council. In the event that a council member's appointment shall not be ratified, the council member may appoint another qualified person, subject to the ratification of the city council. In the event that no such appointment is ratified, or a council member declines to make an appointment, the appointment will be made by a majority vote of the council.
Okay.
As Commissioner Cuff,
Oh, sorry.
as Commissioner Cuff was appointed by Councilmember Dearness, Councilmember Dearness should appoint a new individual to serve on the Planning Commission. Alternatively, the city received applications over the last several months, and of the applications received, several individuals were appointed to serve. The remaining current applicants are Gay Infante, Kenny Escolama, and Gregory Milliken. Councilmember Dearness could select any individual from the applicant list above, although, that's correct. Should Councilmember Dearness decline to appoint a commissioner, the City Council as a whole may appoint from the applicant list above. The City Council may also direct staff to advertise for and accept new applications for a determined time period and bring the item back to City Council for appointment after the application period has ended. This particular option would cause an extended vacancy on the Planning Commission. And the last option would be to provide alternative direction to staff.
Now, our current council guidelines basically states that each council member gets their appointment to the Planning Commission subject to ratification of the board, right? And I believe this is Chris's.
This Commissioner
Appointment.
Cuff was Chris's appointee.
Okay. Are there any questions of the staff report?
I just wanted to also point out, it's also in the municipal code in addition to the council guidelines. So if the council was looking to change something, there would be 2 levels to change on that. It's not just in the council guidelines.
Got
Actually, I asked the question earlier, and I think you gave me a wonderful response, and I wanted that to be shared with the council with respect to the appointment of planning commissioners from the city of Solvang versus outside the city of Solvang. Did you want to comment on that? I think it would be very useful.
If the council's interested in hearing it, the question basically was whether non-residents could be appointed to the planning commission. There's nothing set forth in either state law or the municipal code that prohibits that. I would say that's unusual. Most cities will have a requirement of either a resident of the city or a business owner, or that they be a registered qualified elector of the city, which indicates a citizenship because they're able to vote. But I did the research. I was not able to find any restrictions on appointing non-residents or even non-citizens for that matter.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
But you're referring to somebody who may own a business in Solvang, but maybe lives in Ballard.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And unfortunately, I find that a lot of the professional people who are architects and engineers, civil engineers, that kind of thing, live out just outside the city limits, but still within the 93463 postal zip code, for example, in Ballard or something like that. So it's really frustrating because there's a lot of wonderfully talented people that have a lot to contribute. They're retired or semi-retired and would love to sit, but they just don't qualify under the current
I have another
code.
question. So when we ask for applications, do we specify in the application process that they have to be a resident of the city of Solvang?
We currently do. The question
So-
that Councilmember Jarnes had asked, is there a restriction on
understand
that?
that,
It's
but
just
what
the
I-
municipal code at this point. So we do have a requirement in the municipal
do?
code that there
Okay.
be a legal resident, but from state law, there is no requirement. So if the council were interested in making that change.
I get it. I
Okay.
thought it wasn't on anything. I was going, we're just
No,
putting this
it's
in
in the
there for-
municipal code
Okay,
under
good.
section 212.
Okay.
We had addressed that
I'm sorry,
earlier.
are there any other questions of the staff report? Okay. With that, we're going to go to public comment. Is there any public comment? We'll take this back to the council for discussion and action. Chris, it's your appointment, so would you like to start?
Yeah, I talked with Scott Gold from, I had recommended that he apply for the BR, and he won that appointment with strong support from this council. And I asked him if he would be willing to step up and be a planning commissioner, and he said yes. So I'm going to go ahead and suggest that he take that position that's been vacated by Mr. Cuff.
Okay. Is that a motion?
I'm sorry, that is a motion. I
Okay.
motion.
I will
move
second,
to
I will
appoint-
second that motion.
Is there any discussion on this item? Okay,
Yes.
okay, Karen?
So, Mr. Gold, having been on the Board of Architectural Review, is an individual that's relatively new to Solvang and to government relations. And I feel that the Planning Commission would benefit by having an appointment of an individual who has experience in the Planning Commission. I also am noting that Mr. Gould is not here to say that he wants to accept this position. We do have an individual in the audience that has served on our Planning Commission, Gay Infante, for a number of years, and I would suggest that we make the appointment of her to the Planning Commission instead of Scott Gould.
Was that a motion or a comment?
That would be my motion,
Okay.
although it is not my appointment, but I am going to make that motion.
Is there a second to that motion? Okay, dies for lack of second. The original motion stands. Can we get a poll?
Councilmember Dearness,
Yes.
Clark,
Yes.
Johnson,
Yes.
Waite,
No?
Mayor Toussaint.
Yes. All right, on to item number 8. Do we need a bathroom break before? No? Okay. All right, can we get a staff report?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, David Gasway, city manager. At the April 22nd council meeting, there was some discussion as it related to the format of the council meeting agenda. I think there was really two things that were discussed under that topic when it came up under council comments. And that was really one, location of council comments on the agenda. But the bigger issue really that was, I think, brought up by Councilmember Dearness was focus on advancing the city council's agenda in terms of the things that you would like to see get done within the city. And so with both of those in mind, the staff report that's before you looked at a variety of different cities and presented 12 other cities' agendas as examples that we went out and looked at to see if there was any recommendation on best practices out there. One of the things that we did in order to make it easily reviewable was on page 309, we put an attachment in there that just did a quick little matrix review of the location of items on all other agendas. So first, what I'm going to just point out here is that the city of Solvang, in terms of the current structure, public comment, manager report, advanced calendar, on down through the council comments being at the end of the agenda, is generally in line with the best practices. Certainly every city does it just a little bit different. For example, Santa Monica is somewhat a standout in that their public comment is the last thing on their agenda. I imagine just typically because they get a lot of public comment, and so they would never get on with the business of the city. Ventura is the outlier in that their council comments are the first thing on the agenda. So before anything out of the gates, Ventura is getting right to council comments. So as it relates to just that general order, council comments, we are generally in line, and we'd be happy to take any direction from council if there was interest in making any movement on the agenda. I know council comments used to be more towards the front end of the council agenda until the interim city manager, Rick Hayden, made the suggestion and moved council comments towards the end. As it relates to the agenda items that are really the council's agenda of goals and things that you want to accomplish, my recommendation would be that just administratively making a switch on our staff report structure so that after you go to your retreat and set what your vision and your goals are for the coming year, that we will then identify directly on staff reports what is and what is not the council's goals. So for example, if it was, council goal number 1, I don't know, what a wastewater treatment plant project, then, a staff report would have a section at the top. So right now we go, our staff reports are recommendation, background, discussion, right up there at the top of that header, we would put, council goal, and then we would just list what council goal it's obtaining. I don't know all of what your goals will be, but that is a common way in which I've seen that done, where it identifies for the public which items are really fulfilling the council's desires in terms of their annual goal setting or longer-term strategic planning. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions of the staff report?
Yeah, does this also incorporate changes to or additions to the advanced calendar? Because I know that we used to have a much a bigger window into things that we wanted to talk about, things that we got nods for under council comments, and unfortunately they seem to have disappeared down a rabbit hole, and they're no longer on the advanced calendar or anywhere else. Is there a way to change the format so that we can all see those things that we had all agreed to from previous sessions there on that advanced calendar, and a date certain as to when we'll be talking about them?
Yeah, excellent question. And a portion of this that I forgot to cover in my presentation. The one outlier for Solvang was that we have an advanced calendar. Out of the 12 cities we reviewed, no other cities using an advanced calendar. In terms of putting out just a long list of topics that are outstanding, that were raised at any point in time, if that's what you're referring to with the advanced calendar, I think that's something we can continue doing. The big concern with putting date certain, which I've mentioned in the staff report, is generally speaking, when we're progressing through a topic to generate a staff report, do the research necessary, if we're just aiming for a target date as opposed to completion of a robust review of that topic, then I think it potentially causes more frustration for the council as we come with something that's half-baked, that's not quite really ready for action of the city council. And so preferably, instead of aiming for target dates, we're aiming on a topic for robust completion, or at a point where we need more council input in order to continue developing that topic.
And how would you negotiate that? Would that be discussed with, say, the mayor? Because I understand that the mayor and you discuss the agenda before it's set.
We generally are discussing what's coming up on a couple of future calendars. Under the council protocols as exist right now, the city manager does set the agenda for council meetings. And that is something that under the council manager form of government is a very common, the most common way that it's done, because the manager, as the administrative head of the government, is the one that is in the best position to determine what that overall flow of a meeting looks like, as opposed to just stacking a meeting with topics that may not necessarily be progressing exactly what the council's desires are as detailed out in their goals or their, in their strategic planning. And so it's about trying to balance an agenda from a timing perspective so that we're not, having these marathon sessions or getting halfway into it to try to split, as well as trying to balance, what are the organizational capacities to put out quality reports that are getting to real good decision points for the council within the dynamic of the everyday operations of city.
And I get that, but some items don't require lengthy summaries to be prepared. For example, Daniel had talked about the attrition, a new attrition policy, or a look at a new attrition policy and put in place. And I think that was done back in February or March.
Yeah, it was like in March that we talked about it, and we actually voted to discuss it, I believe, and we had 3 votes to discuss implementing a policy or discussing a policy. So I'm more concerned with those items that we actually vote on, because that's another way to get items on the agenda, is to get the majority of the council to vote on them. So I'm not necessarily concerned about them being on the next agenda, but I would love to have a list of those things so that they're not just long forgotten, so that at least we can bring them up and say, yeah, we're working on this, or so I think that's a concern as well as far as the advanced calendar. And we can keep the advanced calendar in-house and discuss it and whatnot. I don't have a problem with that.
Okay, that would be a recommendation to go that way.
Are there any other questions of the staff report? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to public comment. Is there any public comment on this item? Seeing none, we'll take this back for council discussion and action. Who would like to start?
Well, personally, I'd like to see a section that really does focus on the goals and visions, or the visions and the strategies that we've been discussing, or some of those advanced calendar items. I know it takes time to put them together, right? I'm not taking that away from you, but I think a reasonable amount of time might be, depending on the issue, 1, 2, or 3 months. If it goes beyond 3 months, there has to be a question as to why, right? So, for example, one of the things that Ed Skitt brought up and reminded us all is that we campaign on the idea of amnesty. I'm not talking about saying people can just do whatever they want to their buildings, whether it's a residential or a business building, but we did talk about a type of amnesty program for people who need time to bring their buildings up to code, whether it's a residential or a business one. And I'm going to defer to Robert, because I think this was one of your topics.
Yeah, and if I can add that, the gentleman that addressed the council last week was talking about a building amnesty, and that was never discussed. It's a permit amnesty. And this has been done by Clark County, Mendocino County. There's about 12 or 13 counties in the state that do this once a year or whatever. And
But I'm just going to interrupt, just because I feel like we're getting a little off topic. The point right now is just to start determining, how we want the flow of the agenda to be the
Correct.
format.
You're right.
Maybe potentially how to put the proper ways to put things on the agenda. All I think would be appropriate on this. But something around, now we're getting a discussion around something that's just totally not,
Well, let me
on topic
ask
right
a
now.
different way then. How would you, since we all agreed to that, we all voted to see that on an agenda, as an agenda item, how would you do that?
All of you,
Because we all agreed that we wanted to see that.
council,
when Rick-
voted on an amnesty program.
Well, a discussion, we wanted it to be an agenda item.
Regardless of the topic.
Right, it could be any topic. But the point is, we wanted,
I must have missed that meeting. I don't think I've missed any meetings.
I'm asking Dave right now. How
So-
would you recommend that we get that on the agenda?
So when under council comments, one council member asks for something to be on a future agenda, and there is concurrence with at least 2 others that, yeah, we would like to discuss that at some point in the future, then that is something that I'm going to take direction from, and we're going to turn it and put it on a future agenda.
So that gets on the advanced calendar.
So it would go on the advanced calendar,
And then-
which is an administrative internal document in my recommendation. From there, though, I've got to balance that. What the council still has not done, which on June 22nd, we will be doing, right? Finally, we have a date. We know when it's going to happen. You will have your goal setting. Those then, once you set those goals, you set the vision of what you want this organization to achieve, then that's what we're going to predominantly focus on as an organization, in addition to just the day-to-day operations of the city. I can understand that, the longer that list gets, the more there's some notion that, we're not progressing things on some advanced calendar.
That is our frustration,
With all due
right?
respect, it takes quite a bit longer to develop some of these things than, if it goes past 3 months, something's wrong. If it goes past 3 months, in my professional opinion, it means that there's too much on the plate. And so I know a few of you in my one-on-ones with you has heard me say that if we want to go fast, we got to slow down a little bit. And so putting 62 things on the agenda, just making up a number, causes us to be fractured in our focus to where we're not focusing on just a few of the most important things.
So then how do we give priority to some of these items?
Well, so
Well-
it's a good question. And through the retreat process, you're going to be developing effectively what your strategic plan is. You're going to be identifying what your goals are, and that list may start out with just, again, using my made-up number, 62 items. And then there will be a process whereby you'll have to rank order those. Doesn't mean they go away, but it just means that you're going to have to rank order those in order of importance. And then what I will do is not only on the agenda, under staff reports that are meeting or, aimed at one of those goals, we will identify clearly that this is, meets council goal number 4, or whatever number it is. And then quarterly, we will come back to you with updates, a document, a formal document that you will receive that updates you on progress on all of the goals. Now, that may mean that some of them that are way down at the bottom of the list that were not prioritized by council may sit there. They may sit there for a long time as we're identifying and working on the top goals of the city
And
council.
is that available to the public?
Of course, it'll be available to the public. It'll be a public document that's brought here quarterly as we're updating you generally and keeping documentation on the progress through your strategic plan.
The reason why I bring this up is because people like Ed Skid love to come up and tell us what a wonderfully chaotic council we have, and we don't know what we're doing, we're not getting anything done. I think this is a way to address people like that.
Okay?
Okay. But let's get back on focus here. We have, this is really to discuss the agenda format and order of operations. So I'm hearing a lot around this advanced calendar item. Is there a desire to follow the staff report here and remove the advanced calendar from the agenda, or do we want to keep it there?
I would like to remove the advanced calendar from the agenda.
Okay.
Is that a motion?
I was just going to ask,
Sorry,
is it
just
remove it
asking
from
a
the
question.
agenda but provided in an alternative format
That-
off
that
agenda?
was- yeah.
Because it can be
Oh, yeah.
provided to council, and that's very common in other cities that I've represented, that it is provided to the council. It's just not part of the agenda packet.
Then
Correct.
I'm okay with that.
Correct.
But why? I guess I'm wondering why.
Well,
One of the reasons is because in the city manager form of government, the city manager sets the agenda. If it appears on an advanced calendar with a date certain and something comes up, whether it's litigation, whether it's a flood, emergency things, that can affect the ordering of the agenda. And it leads to an idea that, okay, if something appears on the agenda and it's going to go forward absolutely on June 18th, and all of a sudden something comes up,
Right.
that flexibility is lost because there's the assumption that if the advanced calendar is on there and the council has approved it, it can't be changed without subsequent approval of the council. So leaving it to the city manager to work the agenda so that it is neither overburdensome or underwhelming, that can be somewhat of an art form. And having it in the council agenda makes that process a little more difficult.
Right. I just wanted the public to understand that.
And what
That's
about
we're
including
trying
that, giving the mayor more of an opportunity, a role in helping to prioritize those things? In other words, I've walked back the idea of a date certain. I get that idea, okay? But what I'm suggesting is I still would like to see priority given to certain things. And yes, we will discuss that at the retreat. And yes, weird things happen during the month and we have to reschedule certain things, right? But I'd like to see the mayor take a bigger role in shaping the agenda. And then also,
And the mayor will on the 22nd, and we'll basically vote on it.
Well,
Just
let's
one
just
of five
back up a
then.
little bit. I just want to express my opinion on this one, because I've thought a lot about the advanced calendar item. I understand taking it off. I also understand, leaving it there. There's also the issue of setting dates on it, and yeah, things happen. You're not always going to make those target dates, and we want quality staff reports versus volume staff reports. So where I was kind of leaning towards was leaving the advanced calendar on the agenda. And the reason why is because it makes it very easy for the public to see the items that this council will be working on in the near future. That's important because if they notice something that's important to them, then they can follow that and show up to the meeting and engage. The other reason, so around just a transparency and accountability thing, I do actually kind of like it being there. It's also another appropriate time where if a council member desires to add something onto the agenda, you can also do that during the advanced calendar. You could request to have something put on the advanced calendar. But one of the things that might relieve some of the concerns here is by just removing the dates of it and just indicating the priority of the items. So that way, if the council indicates, you take all the items on the advanced calendar and you just put them priority 1, 2, 3, 4, then you're giving direction to the city manager on what items this council sees as a higher priority, and the ones that are lower priority. That allows the ones that are just, kind of like what you're mentioning before, these really small items that are lesser priority, they could sit there for quite some time, but at least then it's kind of expected or okay, because if it's in the low priority category, if it's in the higher priority category, then you know what the council is generally looking for and what we want to prioritize. Also, during the advanced calendar section, if certain items were on there and they're listed by priority, and the council all of a sudden desired to express interest in moving the priority of one of those items either down or up, it could be expressed during that point during the meeting. So that was kind of where I was leaning on that. Council comments is also another area where you can request to put things on the agenda. So you could have, I do actually like the advanced calendar being more towards the beginning of the meeting, because that's when more people are here, and that's when you want the public to hear the items that will be coming up in the future. So that is an opportunity where you could request things to also go on the advanced calendar, and then council comments towards the end then allows you to finish off with any comments from all the way up to that day, what events you've been at, etc., as well as you could request to have something put on the agenda at that time as well, or any comments you have about the actual meeting. So that's just where I was leaning.
Then why possibly just don't call it a calendar? List your goals. Make it open to the public, for the public to see what the goals of the council are, instead of putting a date on things, because I think that's what you're looking for. You want people to know what
advanced
what's a
agenda
priority.
items, or however you want to word it. But I was just suggesting that it's priority based versus
There will be some
scheduled
priority
date.
ranking, right? I mean, for example, the last time they did this last year, there was some kind of like A, B, C, and then numbers behind them. I don't see why we couldn't group them like that. Here are the priority A items that need to be done in the next 3 months. We're hoping to get them done in the next 3 months. Doesn't mean that they're going to happen, but that's a goal. And then priority B might be within 6 months, that kind of thing.
I think that I've listened to all the comments. The advanced calendar can be covered under council comments, because in our council comments, that's where we should be throwing things out that are important to us. So
So like combine the two together. Is that what you're
combine
saying?
the two, and not necessarily call it an advanced calendar, but within your council comments, just note that you might want to say, something that I'd be interested in bringing to the public in a future agenda might be, and then you say that.
Plus, it's going to go in the
So
minutes, too.
are you suggesting like it's you combine them all as one? You have council comments, advanced agenda items, and city manager's report. And it's all done right then and there.
Well, the city manager's report would be separate from the council comments in the advanced calendar, but I'm just saying that in the council comments, that would be the time for us to express what we might want on a future agenda. And whether or not it actually gets on the agenda, who knows, but it would be in the minutes that we had suggested that it be on the agenda.
Yeah, so it's out there.
So
I
you want
just
split-
don't want to commit us to putting something on an agenda and have people show up thinking that it's going to be on it, and it's not. So I think the reason that we get people to show up is we post our agenda well in advance, and they see what's going to be on the agenda, so they show up.
Yes, that's the problem with putting a date on it, because if they see that and all of a sudden it doesn't happen at that
Right.
date, then they're expecting. So that's where I was suggesting the idea of a priority-based advanced agenda versus an advanced calendar specifying certain dates. That does lead for disappointment when all of a sudden that date isn't met.
And just to point out, that's what your strategic plan will be. It will be your goals that you want to see accomplished, rank ordered by what's most important to you. And then that is the agenda by which we'll work. That's the agenda then that we'll put together action plans to deliver on those goals. I think what we're talking about more is, you know, when do these things come up? How do they happen? What's the time frame? And that's where most all of them, I don't know, right? I mean, I don't know how long it will take. It could be, as the city attorney pointed out, there could be litigation. You could be held up waiting for 3 weeks on answers from a partner agency. I mean, there's lots of reasons why these things may take longer than 60 or 90 days. And that's where I'm here to deliver on your overall agenda of goals, which you will detail out and prioritize on June 22nd, and that we will then put action plans together to deliver for you. Just from a practical sense, I want to highlight this exact challenge that we have in a structure where under council comments, it's routine for council members to add items to an agenda and ask particularly for date certain. This meeting in and of itself is predominantly CalPERS and OPEB funding, city council agenda format, and council committee goals discussion, which on April 22nd, the meeting of April 22nd, which was also the date that Councilmember Johnson had requested a conversation on a policy for outsourcing. At that meeting, that was my second meeting, second regular council meeting as your city manager. I purposefully held that agenda light. I purposefully held things off because we were starting to try to get ahead. I was trying to get my staff ahead of items that we were going to be bringing in the future, so that they had a little bit of extra time to really put the nuance and work into making quality staff reports, making stuff quality. At that meeting, the council asked for 4 different things, 3 of which are what we're here tonight talking about, that I don't think are exactly advancing your overall big picture vision, as I've talked with each of you individually. And so once you go through the retreat process, you put together a strategic plan, you will be identifying your big picture goals. That then is what I'm going to be working to deliver on, and that is you rank ordering what's important, because again, if it's all important, then nothing's important, and I don't think anybody's saying that. But I want to just highlight that, you know, after the 22nd, the things we'll be working on and trying to deliver for you will get much more clear in terms of the things that the city staff are going to be working on at your request and direction.
Yeah. So I understand and I agree with a lot of that, and I don't think anyone was expecting a long first meeting on your first start date. But again, I'm just looking at determining how we want the flow to work moving forward. So I'm just trying to get us to start moving forward here. Is there this topic around the advanced calendar? Is there desire to keep it there or remove it? If we keep it there, how do we want to organize it? I'm just trying to start just going down the list here, if there's any indication I can get.
Well, if we keep it there, I would put the advanced calendar at the end. I've noticed after looking at this matrix a couple times that public hearings in other cities often come very close, right after public comment. And committee reports, I would move to the end, because often people aren't coming to city council meetings to hear our individual committee reports. They want to know direct city business that's going on right then. Other than moving those
So in
around,
your
I'm fine
opinion,
with
just to understand, are you suggesting council comments at the beginning of the meeting and then advanced calendar at the end?
that. I'm suggesting advanced calendar at the end.
Okay.
I mean, if we're going to keep it on there. And I like the council comments. I like public comment, public hearing, city manager report, consent calendar, regular agenda. And committee reports at the very end.
I agree with that.
I think I'd rather have council comments at the end and just have the committee reports where it is, just because I don't want to, I think if we go long on our comments, we could just no one will report on the committees because they just want to get out of here. So I'd like to hear from what the committees are reporting.
I have
But-
to second that, because a lot of times something that we've found in a discussion with somebody leads to a need to
Discuss.
do something about it. Not, yeah, I mean, there was an agreement to put it on the future agenda. So hypothetically, I'm just making this up. Ryan and I, because we're on the sewer system committee, we go out, we talk to somebody, we find something that's actionable, we bring it back to the council. I think we need to discuss this. But we wouldn't have done that if we had that after the council comments. So by putting it forward.
Well, but the appropriate to bring that, place to bring that up would be underneath that committee report. So if there's something that you want advanced there, then that would be the time to report on that and make a suggestion for the council to consider, if it's gonna be an item that you wanna bring back up.
So you're saying you could do that either way?
So during the committee reports, we can do that. So is there a point to even having council comments then?
Well, council comments covers everything that's, you know.
Out in the
It could
committees.
be anything. I attended XYZ event.
Incorporate
I mean, there's,
So anything not to do
um,
with the committees?
And then that, I still like council comments being at the end then. Because it's like a cleanup, you know, somebody, I just prefer it to be at the end. I like the idea of the advanced calendar being, as Karen suggested, more toward the end. I think that makes sense. And then-
well, part of the advanced calendar though, and the one thing that I do like is we have the city manager's report. And I really like the report that you gave on the last, meeting that we just had a week ago. And I do think it's important that we do have some kind of report going out at each meeting, and that kind of fits along with the advanced calendar. So with that, I like the idea of the city manager's report and advanced calendar towards the beginning, you know, because I think that's just it just kind of ties things together so people see the progress that's going on in the city, meeting to meeting, you know, what it is that you're prioritizing, what's been accomplished, what's currently, you know, being worked on. I think that's really, you know, important for people to hear. And that kind of is a little bit of what was being done with council comments before. I think some of the council members were just updating on activities that were happening in the city and stuff like that. But all that could be summed up and done very quickly in the city manager's report.
I agree. I think, I like it where it was at the beginning. And I like the economic, council reports toward the end, the council comments after that, in case we had to do any cleanup.
So let's just propose that we did it that way. If it was a city manager's report and advanced calendar at the beginning, and then you'd have, what would it be, committee reports, and then council comments following that? Is that what I'm hearing?
That's what I agree.
Yeah.
So we're not really changing the order of anything,
So, well, if we did that, then the next, which is fine, I mean.
which is fine.
You're going through the motion. But no complainers after this. Then you'd have the item for the advanced calendar. So if we keep it at the beginning, like I said, I have a desire in keeping the advanced calendar there as an informational thing. I think that's just important for transparency and accountability, and for the public to know the items that, you know, are going to be coming up here. But my opinion on that is that they should be priority based versus, you know, date. And it's not a date. It's just setting the priority. And, you know, the city manager can generally set that priority as he suggests. If you know, the council also sees something that they think is should be prioritized a little bit differently, then you could make that request.
Okay, I mean, if we kept everything the same and we just moved the public hearings after the public comment,
Public hearing?
we have our public comment and then public hearings. And then move on with the rest. City manager report, advanced calendar, consent calendar.
Don't we do that now?
Yeah. Because every agenda has public comment afterwards, a public hearing afterwards.
We're not changing anything.
Yeah, you know, you'd still keep public communications at the very beginning. We do have to do that.
I think she's talking
Well,
about the public.
you
hearing.
have
Oh,
to,
wait, no, actually,
Oh, I'm
you have to
thinking more
provide an
public hearings
opportunity.
as in workshops, whatnot,
Presentations.
not public comment
Oh,
after,
presentations?
after an agenda item.
You mean presentations?
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking, more on those lines.
Yeah, I think there's two things there. General business are items where there's more discussion on staff presentations, and then there's opportunity for public comment. Public hearing is something that actually requires a noticed public hearing For example, acceptance of grant funds from the state or the federal government typically requires a public hearing where, 10 days or 14 days in advance, you have to put a notice in a paper of general circulation and you have a formal hearing on it. And so I think those are a little bit of a nuance there. Sometimes we don't have public hearing items on the agenda, and if they're not, then that section just isn't there on our agenda.
So couldn't that fall under the consent calendar?
No, because they're required to have a hearing on them. So that's where formally the mayor, upon staff presentation and any questions for clarification, it's formally open the public hearing. And I think there's probably legal reasons as to the function of the public hearing.
Yeah, and there are different types of public hearings. They have different appellate remedies depending on how they come up, because there are public hearings that are required, for example, for a zoning code amendment. That is a legislative act. There are also public hearing requirements from an appeal from the Planning Commission's decisions, which is a quasi-adjudicative type of decision. There are public hearing requirements that are attached to things that are neither really clearly legislative or quasi-adjudicative, like grant funding. That is typically construed as a legislative action, receiving grant funds. But because the public entity granting those funds requires a public hearing, the city has to structure it as a public hearing, even though it's not really the same where you're accepting evidence, making a judgment based on the existing rules.
Alrighty.
Okay. So am I seeing kind of a consensus for keeping council comments at the end and committee reports, and keeping the advanced calendar, not getting rid of it, but making it a priority-based future agenda items versus date-driven?
Yeah, take calendar out.
Make the motion.
Do we even need a motion on this, or can we just give direction?
Yeah, because we're not really changing.
So if I understand it,
Not changing anything.
other than just the way we format the advanced calendar, everything's staying status quo.
Correct.
I don't think you need any action.
Well, I think the whole thing was driven was basically by differences in opinion over whether to have council comments at the beginning of the meeting or the end of the meeting.
Absolutely.
So-
And on how we're advancing this council's overall agenda for
Yeah.
goals and
To me,
vision.
that was the most
I
important
think if we have the
distinction.
if we have the advanced calendar out there with the goals, then that probably does cover a lot of our council comments, because our council comments revolve around what we want to speak about, so.
Okay. All right, with that, we have item number 9. Do we need
Actually, number
do we need a
4.
bathroom break? Everyone's good? Okay.
Keep rolling. All right, so the next item is discussion on council subcommittees. Again, there was some conversation about bringing back, at the request of the mayor, this item for discussion. I think some of the committees and ad hoc subcommittees, some of them were a little bit clear, and so the staff report before you was really an attempt to try to put some framework around a way that, most importantly, we can be identifying what the city's goals should be in some of these committee structures, particularly as it relates to intergovernmental relations boards like SBCAG or joint powers associations, so that when the members of those committees are attending, then you have some understanding of what the collective council's goals are as it results to topics on those agendas. And so what we did was tried to lay this out in a format that could almost in effect, with a little bit more tweaking, become sort of your legislative priorities for the future, whereby you're looking at different topics, whether it be water, wastewater, groundwater, sustainability, and identifying, globally what our goals are as it relates to attendance in these bodies that may be, semi-legislative or in nature. And so what we did was line through all of the committees that exist right now, identified what the member was of that committee, the frequency of those meetings. I tried to identify some goals for you based on input from staff or prior conversations of this city council, and then identified public transparency. So I think in looking at, observing some of the conversations that we've been having, there's some question as to whether or not some of these subcommittee structures are publicly transparent or subject to open meetings laws. So we tried to identify that. So it may be most effective, particularly as it relates to some of the goals, that a lot of that was really just staff taking, some opportunity based on our understanding of the topics, and identifying those goals for you. But certainly we would look for any input that this council may have in those goals for any of these committees. One quick note, it was brought to my attention after we put the staff report out and continued the meeting that I had missed one. So there was an Economic Development Ad Hoc Subcommittee with Council Members Johnson and Dearness that was formed at the April 8th meeting. And so I would add that to this. I'm thinking that this type of structure can be a living long-term document that would come back to you at some frequency, twice a year or something like that, just for a check-in in case things change and out there. So I don't really have, that's pretty much my presentation, really just kind of trying to describe what we did here. And I would look certainly for council feedback on any of these individual committees. The one recommendation I would have is that some of these, we're calling them ad hoc committees, but for example, the ad hoc Finance Committee, Water Committee, Library Committee, and Parks and Rec Committee meet at some regularity over the years. Finance Committee is a really good example, though they may only have 1 or 2 meetings per year. Typically, they're at the same time of year, right ahead of the budget period. It is possible that those meetings could be subject to open meeting requirements under the Brown Act, and so my recommendation would be to effectively remove the word ad hoc from those committees, make them real committees. Ahead of a meeting of, say, the Finance Subcommittee, we would publish a real simple agenda letting the public know that the Finance Committee would be meeting. And really what those committees are doing, in my mind, is starting to shape policy for the City Council. So when the City Council designates 2 members to be subcommittee members, they're really authorizing those 2 to help to start shape the policy that might be related to the budget, for example, as a way to make the full council meetings a little bit more efficient and quick moving on a go-forward basis, so that there's not so much sausage making here in council chambers. A little bit of it gets done ahead of time, so that staff gets a little bit more direction on some of those bigger operational topics. So with that, that's my presentation. Available for any questions.
Are there any questions on the staff report? Seeing none, go to the public comment. Does anyone wish to speak on this item? Bring this back to the council for discussion action. Who would like to start?
I will.
Okay.
I'll take the staff direction in dropping the ad hoc and making these actual committees.
Those are standing committees then.
Yes. And in thinking about this before, I completely agree with that, and make them actual committees. And that way, if people, you post it 2 days in advance, you've got a meeting in here or wherever, and people want to come, they can come. And it's completely out in the open, and we can let everybody know what we're working on.
So then the Finance Committee would meet with you to help shape policy, but you'd have to do this in public, and you'd have to report out anything you guys produced?
Yes. Yeah. So what we would really do is just do action minutes of those meetings. So we're not going to record the meetings or put them on the website, but what we would do is any actions that came as a result of those, we would publish minutes that are just the actions of that meeting.
So with that, with each one of those meetings, I just see more overhead just because you're going to have to develop a staff report and everything like that.
Generally, we wouldn't be doing staff reports for those. So budget development, for example, like agency requests, right? So the Finance Committee meets, there's conversations about the agency grant requests, That's your conversation, then you give direction to staff, say, okay, well, we're gonna, designate this much money for these granting agencies. The action minutes after that would just say that, they would say that, the committee made a recommendation to the full council for, X number of funding on these committees. And then that item eventually comes back to the full council under the budget hearing, and then it would be the finance committee recommended this funding strategy, or, this funding of these agencies under the grant program.
Which is how it is right now, basically, just not on the public meeting format when we're getting together as a finance committee.
Correct.
So is the public allowed to make public comment at these meetings? I mean, how are they structured the exact same as city council meetings, or?
Generally speaking, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there'd be
So
a public
feasibly,
comment.
we could have a meeting that's 2 hours long that maybe would have taken us 30 minutes to bring back to the council on, budgetary items, because everyone wants to comment on what they want to comment on if they know it's coming up.
You could, in my experience in a couple of different jurisdictions, that's not been the case.
One of the reasons why I was asking for this to come up was really more in response to we have basically a whole new council here. We have goals or positions that I'm aware of that the council previously at large, had on some of these items. And you really need to, if people are going to be running with these several different committees that we have, you really need to be somewhat on the same page, so that you understand the goals that committee is working on or working towards. Otherwise, it can be just a waste of time, because you got two people chasing down, one area with staff, bringing back something that the whole council then just says, oh, well, this is junk, and throws it out. And then also you want each council member generally to know what the goals are in each one of these ad hocs and committees, and that kind of gives a little bit more confidence as well to staff when they spend their time and resources on some of these things, that they're going to bring back something that this council actually wants to get done. It sounds to me like all these have always been, most of them, I think pretty much all of them have been ad hocs before, right? We have the Joint Wastewater Committee that actually was publicly held, and then the Economic Committee that was here last year was actually publicly held and noticed. But I think the rest were on hiatus or generally not run that way. The exception you have is SB-CAG and APCD, because those are always going to be the county boards that you have.
Yeah, now the EMA.
And now the SGMA. So I guess the question is, do some of these, do we move them away from being ad hoc to being committees that you run in that kind of format? There's obviously, you have to deal with the extra inconvenience of not just being able to just call up the other representatives on the other board and meet at a coffee shop or whatever and discuss items. You're going to have to schedule them here. We're going to have staff report. We're going to have staff, right? Because you're going to have minutes being taken. So all that is just a lot of extra work on some of these committees on staff level.
There's a little bit of extra work, yes.
Yeah. So with that, I was really looking to go, run down each one of these and get back from staff what some of the prior goals were that they suggest that we should be trying to accomplish on some of these items, and then some of the goals that these committees should have, be it ad hoc or a public meeting. So I don't know if we want to just roll down each one of these and just kind of discuss them and make a decision on each one. Or either way, you should have goals. It's
Right.
up to the council and desire whether they want it to be an ad hoc or a standing committee. Is that?
Yeah, but I think should be done in the context of the retreat, because, for example, if you have a vision or a strategy for wastewater, for example, then that suggests there's going to be certain goals that we want to set forth or set down, and then pursue them within that particular committee, right? If we try to set goals now, we can hear what they did in the past, but I'm not ready to set goals for the future until we had a chance to sit down at the retreat.
So again, this was kind of brought up well before we even knew when we'd get a retreat date and stuff. So, I mean, you could scrap the whole thing and not set goals on any of these right now, or you could, begin having some discussions over what some of the goals are on some of these items. But yeah, we do have the retreat in now a month, so you could just wait until then. But the complaint that I was kind of hearing before or expressed was, you have people in these different committees and you don't know what, it is that they're necessarily pursuing. So
I'd heard that too. I am curious, somebody brought this up in the context of Brown Act violations. What's the red line with respect to a committee?
no,
That
what,
part I get. I'm talking about shaping
what he's
policy.
referring to is ad hoc versus committee, because there's still, you have the Open Meeting Act.
It's,
So.
my concern is kind of like we've been being told for 4 months that we should keep these as ad hoc committees to avoid having all these
Brown Act problem.
problems, right? I mean, that's what I've been being told for 4 months now. And then now we're coming back and we're saying, hey, let's go the other way. Let's make them all public and get rid of some of them because now we want to have it that way. So I'm just I'm a little confused as to what this is all about. I mean, for 4 months now I've been being told this, so.
So maybe I can help there. What your staff report shows and what the recommendation is there's 4 areas right now where you have quote-unquote ad hoc committees that, in my professional opinion, are not exactly running like ad hoc. They're not for a temporary period to talk about a targeted, topic for a couple of meetings and then they go away forever. Action happens, or there's a recommendation and we move on. Finance, water, libraries, and parks and recreation are operations of the city. Libraries being a caveat to that it's not exactly our operation, but that we're pretty heavily involved in. If 2 council members want to meet with me, or 2 council members want to meet together, or 2 council members want to meet with a member of the public to talk about a topic, you don't need a committee for that. You don't need an ad hoc committee. And so as it relates to these 4 functional operational areas, the recommendation is to make those formal committees. And if they're more formal committees, then the best practice would be that you're subject to the Brown Act. You're going to do open meetings on those. And I don't know the full range, but in talking with staff, I'm thinking that these are maybe 10 meetings per year at most for these 4 ad hoc committees that exist right now. Some of these other ad hoc committees that were created over time, I don't think they need to be ad hoc committees. The recommendation would be that there doesn't need to be, formal sanctioning as a committee for 2 council members to talk about a topic. And so the recommendation right now is that if you want to, work with the city manager, or 2 members get together to meet with, for example, one committee was the Chumash subcommittee that is really just a relationship committee. Well, two council members can get together with representatives of the Chumash and have a conversation over lunch or whatever for relationship building. That doesn't need to be a formal committee. And so I think at the end of it, it's really more about ad hoc committees are intended to be short-term focused. Yet we have some standing committees in effect that are just called ad hoc committee for purposes of not having open meetings.
I can add to that a little bit. The word ad hoc committee doesn't appear in the definition of legislative body under Government Code Section 54952. What it talks about is a standing committee of a legislative body that has a continuing jurisdiction. So if we've got these committees that have a continuing jurisdiction, regardless of what we call them, ad hoc or otherwise, they may have been ad hoc at the time they started, but they have institutionalized over time. To avoid there being a Brown Act problem with those institutionalized subcommittees, we agendize them and have the meetings in public.
Oh, I get that.
Okay.
But why have we not done this for the last 10 years?
Because they have been described as ad hoc. They have not met that often. There haven't been any issues of bleed over between
They haven't met that often. The Finance Committee hasn't met every year for
Well,
over
that
budgets.
one I don't know of their regular meeting schedule, how much it was. If it just came in every year for a couple weeks to go through the budget and so on, then that may not be something that's a standing jurisdiction. It does its work very quickly and then it's done. It doesn't meet the rest of the year. I don't know what its meeting schedule was and whether or not it was kind of institutionalized what we're talking about. But the better practice, as David says, is to, if you're going to have this standing committee that is a continuing jurisdiction, just make it a Brown Act committee, agendize it. Then you don't have any issues about whether or not it is a violation of the Brown Act or not.
So once again, where's the red line?
The red line is whether or not it's a standing committee that has continuing jurisdiction or whether it's been set a meeting schedule by a charter, ordinance, resolution, or formal action of the city council. That's the red line.
So I think the main confusion here is just how it's been done for, 10 plus years, and then all of a sudden the,
Well,
recommendation for change.
I
But
think it goes to the intent and the purpose. Like they were saying, these guys get together on a regular basis for a very specific thing. It's very consistent. The idea is the same idea over time. Whereas the economic development group that we kind of formulated, it is a true ad hoc. We just meet whenever we feel like it, and we have it's like, oh, did you think about that idea? We should go find something out, more about that, or explore that a little bit. It's not there to shape policy. It's about finding out facts, and then hopefully, if it's useful, bring it back to the council for a nod to do something about it. Is that
Okay.
right? That's an ad hoc, right?
So aside from that, I think the other thing that's making it viewed more as a committee versus a ad hoc would be once we start defining goals by the council for it to achieve. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, one of the purposes of having these committees is that you can't get everything done in a city council meeting. So you say to two members, okay, finance, we want you to look at the budget, report back to us, provide us your recommendations. Then the council as a whole doesn't have to go through every single thing. And if you have those subcommittees that have that ability where they're still getting input from the public at those meetings, then it facilitates faster action by the council when it comes forth. It's not to say that it's going to be a rubber stamp at the council by any means, but it's going to facilitate that process when it comes back. Same is true of the other types of committees. Having that public input is important into some of those standing committees, because the concern under the Brown Act is that if it is a subcommittee that is going to be taken very seriously by the council as a whole, that decisions are being made by a subcommittee that are rubber stamped by the council. That's why you have that provision for the standing subcommittee being a legislative body covered by the Brown Act in that section of the government code.
So that's the red line.
So I'm sorry. So it's when you start actually establishing goals and tasking that committee with accomplishing.
Shape
Well,
policy.
ultimately,
Shape
you're
policy.
going to be, if you want to delegate the establishment or carrying out of those goals to two members of a subcommittee, a council subcommittee, that is something you can do. That's something you can discuss at your retreat. Okay, this is what we want an X subcommittee to do. You take care of this goal, subcommittee, report back to us in 3 months. Now you have a standing subcommittee, they have a continuing jurisdiction, they're carrying out a council goal or reporting back to the council on a council goal as to what they've accomplished.
Got it. So if you had, I'll just pick one of these apart. For example, like the ad hoc water subcommittee. If the intent on that is basically just to maintain intergovernmental relations, then that would be a true ad hoc, because there's really nothing.
There's no continuing jurisdiction.
There's no
They may
goal
never
by the
need a
body.
meeting.
Right.
It may not
Right.
be furthering a council goal at that point. But if someone from the outside says, hey, I'd like to meet with two council members, they say, oh, yeah, there's an ad hoc committee. Go ahead and do that real quickly and report back.
It gets them quicker to the subject experts versus.
Rather than bringing it to the council as a whole, having to agendize it, perhaps having a staff report, and having this format of a city council meeting where they have 3 minutes to speak or they have a presentation time. Sometimes they just want to say, we'd like to widen this section of a street in our jurisdiction. I'd like to talk to a couple council members, bounce it off them.
So, so just following that line of thought, like if you had, for example, the water ad hoc subcommittee that was really there for maintaining intergovernmental relations, but then you had certain goals that came up over time, you could then report those out. But then instead of those goals being goals that are that of the ad hoc, they are goals of the city manager or in staff. Then that is off the committee, right? Is that?
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, ultimately, all the goals that both the council, subcommittee, and city staff are trying to accomplish are the council's goals. Staff doesn't have specific goals other than to carry out your goals. Does that make sense?
No, I think it's just like more of the format of how they're. To me, it seems like once you start applying goals to some of these ad hocs, they then start becoming committees. I think that's kind of what I'm reading between the.
It could, if you give a specific task to a subcommittee where you say, okay, there's going to be two of you, go do this and report back, and then there's never any meetings again. versus this is our goal in terms of, I'll just throw it out, pension stability. We'd like to form a formal pension stability subcommittee. We want you to review every 3 months what the status is of our actuarial, find ways to report back to council, and that's more of a standing committee. That has a continuing subject matter jurisdiction. It's carrying out a council goal in that regard, but it has a more formalized structure that, that the council has delegated to it.
Okay.
I think the library, I think, is a good example of this because there's some disparities with county funding right now. We have a deficit. There's a disparity in the per capita spending between Buellton and Solvang. And then I've been meeting with several people because of my passion for books and libraries. And I almost wish we had an open meeting because there's a lot of people in this town that really, really, really support and love the libraries as I do. And it would be kind of almost like a workshop. I guess you can still do that in an ad hoc format. But it'd almost be neat to get a lot of citizen improvement because there is a lot of passion about the library in this town. So I could see that being a separate committee more than an ad hoc. But then again, you take away the informality if you do it in this kind of a setting. But, I mean, one of the friends of the library and I are going to try and go meet with Joan Hartman. So does that make it more above an ad hoc committee?
Again, the word ad hoc doesn't exist
We're trying to
in there.
lobby.
It's whether it's a standing committee or not.
Okay.
If it's not a standing committee and you're just meeting on an occasional basis, you can call that an ad hoc, but it's really the question under the Brown Act is it a standing committee? Does it have continuing jurisdiction? Is it established by formal action of the city council? If you answered yes to those, then you should be following the Brown Act with it. If it's 2 members of a truly ad hoc committee, they're just, hey, this inquiry came in from the library about funding. Do you, council member, want to get together and talk about that? That's going to be the true definition of your ad hoc committee.
Okay.
I think there's just a lot of confusion because it's something that's been going on the same way for 10 plus years, and then also, so that's just hard to get our heads to accept that.
Understood. Different city managers, different styles. So I'm going to err on the side of transparency and caution when it relates to state law, and so that's where my recommendations come from. My first night here, when you guys approved my contract, one of the things that I said you can expect from me is transparency, and that's the basis of my recommendations when it comes to these committees that I think have longer-term jurisdiction over operational matters of the city.
So maybe somewhat of a difference in opinion of the prior city manager and now our new city manager.
I think so.
So do we want to vote to separate these tonight?
Well,
Or wait till the 22nd?
it might be more appropriate if we're not going to talk about actual goals for these tonight, and we're going to wait for the retreat. Then it's probably more appropriate just to really think about some of the goals for some of these committees, and then express those during the retreat, and then we can get recommendation from legal on whether or not we call it an ad hoc or a subcommittee, because it sounds like there might be a desire here to convert more of these over into committee type meetings that we publicly notice. Does that make sense?
Yep.
I mean, if that's the direct, we don't need a motion. We can just.
And I'm happy to take one question. There was one of these committees where the Indian Gaming Local Benefit Committee recommendation is just to remove that. I don't think that committee exists anymore. So are you guys, and nods would work, are you guys good with us modifying this document and remove any of the committees that really don't exist?
I'm okay with that.
I'm fine with that.
Sure you are. It's my committee.
But when the first line of your committee says hiatus,
So if there's no other direction or comment, then we're done with this item, right? And I believe with that we're adjourned because I think we've gone through everything.